Here we go. Hey, welcome to History Chats. Here we go. Yeah, so we're back with a live program here. Thanks for joining us. Today we're talking about a very interesting topic. Now, this month, last week, towards the end of the week, would have been Veterans Day. We, in the past, have done sort of military stories, and that was kind of the idea, and then we had some stuff that came up that we switched. So, but for the rest of the month, we're going to be talking about some military-themed stuff, which has some really interesting stories attached to it, I think. Today, we're going to start out with the Spanish-American War, which is a conflict that I think, in the scheme of American history, and certainly here, it's maybe not as I don't think when you think of like wars that the American, the USA has fought, we don't necessarily immediately jump to the Spanish-American War. It is a conflict that has had and continues to have, huge ramifications for the direction of our country and the world. But it is one of those conflicts in which it's very quick. This is not one of those situations where, even as we'll see, the people taking part don't necessarily have a direct, prolonged experience in combat or, going through. Like it's actually pretty straightforward, and the United States kind of wins really easily, and then, off we go. But there's a really interesting story here, and one that I will admit I'm still piecing together bits and pieces of it. I thought I understood the experience, and then I started looking into it and realized, oh, there's more to it than this. So I'm excited to share some of that with you today. Caveat though, even though I think that I don't want to get too deep into like the larger history of the conflict and like why it came to be and all of this sort of thing, I do think that a little bit of explanation is important because, typically we don't really know. So it's the Spanish-American War. So there's two plus participants, Spain and the United States. So in America, right? Spain, what's up with Spain? Well, Spain has been having some rough times. This is the extent of the Spanish Empire around 1790s, at the end of the 1700s. And they are, even at this point, they're not as large as they once were. There was a time in which the Spanish Empire, ruling from the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, was clearly the most dominant nation in the world. If you call it that. The 1800s were not kind to them, though. For a variety of reasons, this, by the time that the Spanish-American War breaks out, is the extent of their colonial holdings. They lost Central America and South America. Most of their colonies either were taken or they were, got their independence and became, independent. They still have a couple holdings, particularly in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Particularly Cuba and the Philippines are ones that, mainly Cuba. That is the one of the few remaining jewels in the crown of the Spanish, and so they really, really don't want to have to lose this. It's one of the economic boons to the community, to their country, and prestige-wise, they can't take another hit. If they lose Cuba, it's over. So they really try hard to keep Cuba. Now, then at the same time, in the 1800s, the Cubans are not exactly excited about being a colony. In fact, they go out of their way to try. There's a long history. These are all brief, sometimes more long-term. The 10 Years' War was definitely one of those. I'm not going to get into the specifics here, but periodically, like generationally, people try to rise up and remain independent. But Spain really tries to keep that iron grip over them to keep them in the in the empire. The United States has also been going through some stuff. By the time I should say by the 1890s, the way that the Cubans see that this one is going to go differently, the out that they find to get out of the situation is, if we can get the Americans on our side, then we will have something. And the Americans are interested. We've gone through our own prolonged period of conflict in the 1800s, the Civil War, um, and all of the things that came with that. But by the 1880s, we are, moving on, and we start to emerge as a major power in specifically the Western Hemisphere. We're not so interested in getting involved in the stuff that's happening in Europe, but if it's happening in our neck of the woods, Europeans shouldn't be meddling here. And we're also increasingly getting involved in sort of investments in different countries and parts of the region from that perspective. And also, we start to see it as sort of humanitarian causes. And this is definitely one of those. We see the Cubans in their plight for independence, even though there is, got to acknowledge the racial component here that often plays a very heavy role in the discussion around this time period. They're not equals in that regard, but they should not have to go through this. And so we start to take a very, as this last, uprising of the Spanish are having to keep the Cubans in line, we want to make sure that they are, things are, we're very sympathetic, right? We don't want to go straight out and just declare war on Spain over this, but we are keeping an eye on the situation. This brings us to the USS Maine. Remember the Maine? Maybe not. This is the USS Maine in January of 1898. It was deployed to Cuba, and it was in the harbor there in Havana to keep an eye on the situation. Basically, we wanted to kind of, keep an eye on how things were developing, protect American interests, investments, and citizens who might be in Cuba, and just kind of keep a closer eye on this. Well, it's probably best known not for that role, but for what comes next. Here it is, illustrated as entering the Havana Harbor. In February, on February 15th, it blows up. And this is one of those events in world history that is, we still don't really know what happened. The United States, President McKinley, despite the urges to do something about this, urges caution. He says, we got to figure out what's going on. The American sort of inquiry into this and the Spanish inquiry into this have differing results, and that is not uncommon. To this day, we still don't know if the Maine was exploded because of a fire that caught the munitions storage and it went up, or whether it was an outside a torpedo or a mine. There is conflicting ideas about this. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter. It does matter, but kind of not for our story, because regardless of whether it was the Spanish that destroyed the ship, or it was an accident, or whether it was the Cubans trying to get us involved, whatever the case might be, there's a lot of theories out there. What ends up happening is the American public decides it must be the Spanish. And it's also worth noting that the traditional narrative here is that sort of the yellow journalism of the time, these newspaper men like Pulitzer and Hearst, yeah, who were big in New York. They definitely saw that they had pretty unscrupulous in terms of their influence, and they pushed for a war so that they knew that they could sell papers from it, right? Does that have an impact here in central Wisconsin? Are we reading the New York papers? Are the newspaper people here taking their cues from Mr. Pulitzer? Probably not. But the result is about basically the same. We ought to go to war. This is too far, right? So that's what ends up happening. There's a slow ramp up here over the course of February into April. It culminates in a blockade. Spain, because we don't really want to be like the ones to declare war, so we put a blockade around Cuba to protect, until we can figure out what happens. And then the Spanish says, nope, that's not cool. We're going to war. And then the U.S. follows suit. So we have a war. Into this, so a general order is called, the call for the mobilization of the military. The United States Army at this point, we have a pretty small standing army traditionally. We don't really have the money, especially in the early years of the Republic, to bankroll a large standing military in the way that European countries can. But also, we're not looking to get involved in European struggles or land wars, protracted things, right? So instead, what we do is we have a military that is, we have a core regulars who are, at this point, at the beginning of 1898, there were about 24 24,593 men under arms as irregulars. The military looks at this and says, okay, we're going to need about double that. We're going to need at least 50,000 in order to fight this war. So a general order is called mobilizing the state militias. So each state has militia companies at a local level. So in Wausau, we have these guys, the Light Guards, Company G. I think this is maybe a little bit later in the 1880s. I'm unsure about the date that I decided to put there, but Goff took this picture. Anyway, yeah, this is not the first or the only one. For a while, there was also the Germania Guard in Wausau. There's also the Unity Guards. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Unity. Pretty early on has their own unit, but it is hard for a community to maintain and support this. These like Company G here is part of a larger structure, but it's up to the local community to commit people to serve and then also to kind of keep it up and running and to contribute to it. So ultimately the Unity Guards disappear, and the Germania Guards, which was actually a larger story, but basically they were the former, they had all served in like the Kaiser's army in Prussia. They were told at some point that they had to stop using the Prussian military handbook and instead speak English and use the American system so that we can kind of be all on the same page. That's kind of where they're coming from. That disbands in the 1880s, and we're left with the Company G. Company G, of course, implies a larger organization. This is the year before. The 1899 Blue Book, for whatever reason, just doesn't include the 3rd Regiment, which they should. But this is basically at the outbreak of the war. This is how we're organized, right? So we've got the 1st Regiment. There's companies within each regiment, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th regiments. These are generally geographically similar. And this Wisconsin National Guard kind of was all of this. They organized the companies into regiments so that we could kind of keep, larger groups. So, for example, each of the companies, as you can see, has between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 10, 12 companies. It varies depending on, again, who can keep one occupied. All of the 4th Regiment is in Milwaukee, so larger cities can do more. Anyway, Wausau and Marathon County in general is grouped into the 3rd Regiment. So here is the Wausau Regiment here. Started December 30th, 1882. At this point, there were 56 members at the beginning or in 1897. Of course, when the war breaks out, the companies should probably be closer to 100 people at full strength, but that was understood that, if war is declared, they would fill the ranks, and they do, with a lot of volunteers. Like I said, the military wanted 50,000 men to fight. They, by the time that all of the National Guards of the states mobilized, had 220,000. So they had quite a bit more, and that was just, I think that's just the first call for mobilization. Or maybe that's the high point, I'm not sure. But so people like, for example, this is George Cook, would ultimately have a long and storied career in the out of Unity, where he lived. When he gets the call, hey, I'm going to join up. Now, he does not go to Wausau. Unity is kind of midway between Wausau and in Marathon County and Clark County, right? So he could have gone to Neillsville, also in the 3rd Regiment. But instead, his experience is slightly different than theirs because he goes to the closer Marshfield, which is Company A of the 2nd Regiment. So, yeah, so Marathon County represented not just in the 3rd Regiment in Wausau's company, but also in the 2nd. I don't know if there's any in the 1st. We'll talk about the 4th in a second. Well, actually, let's talk about the 4th. Okay, so the call comes out. The 3rd Regiment mobilizes and is mustered into service at Camp Harvey in Madison on May 11th. The following day, the 2nd Regiment is mustered in on the 12th, and then on the 14th, the 1st is. The 4th doesn't. And I think what ends up happening is they decide to keep the 4th and basically take those soldiers, those young men as part of that, and kind of fill the ranks to bring the rest of it up to strength. So there are people from Milwaukee scattered in the rest of this as well. And there will eventually be a 4th Regiment. Again, later in the year, there'll be a second call for volunteers, and at this point, Wisconsin organizes the 4th Regiment. Notably, again, we have members here. This is C.S. Cohn and his band. Traditionally, each regiment is allocated funds to maintain a band. And again, I think I've told this story wrong. I've come to more information in the last 24 hours. I assumed what I do know happened is when the call came to mobilize, the 4th Regiment in Milwaukee doesn't mobilize their band. The guy who's in charge of that has grandchildren. He is not going to go fight in Cuba or the Philippines or wherever he's going to be called to fight. So he says, no thanks. I always assumed that then this is a replacement. But actually, the whole of the 4th Regiment is disbanded and integrated into the first 3, and then they create a 4th Regiment, which doesn't actually go directly to the same experience that the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd did. But C.S. Cohn, he is in Wausau at this point, about 2 years at this, maybe a year and a half. He volunteers to put a band together, made up of kind of the core of his Central Wisconsin guys that he had been working with as a band leader, and he pulls in a bunch of other people. Sorry, I got to throw the band stuff in here because this is the stuff that I do know. We also have the former Wausau resident, Frank Dana, who is the 3rd Regimental Band. He had the 3rd Regimental Band back in the 1880s, but in the 1890s he gets tempted away by the Appletonians. Appletonians? People from Appleton basically bribed him to move to their city. And then he goes to Marinette and a bunch of other places. But he will actually be reunited with the Company G and his musicians is part of the experience that they are going to go through. But the 4th Regiment is interesting. They get mobilized immediately. They get sidetracked. They got sent up to Oshkosh to deal with a labor strike that happens with some woodworkers. And then when that is done, they send them down. By this point in September, the war is pretty much over. So they spend a few months down at a military camp as a garrison in Alabama. But anyway, let's talk about the 3rd Regiment, because that's the exciting part here. These are the core of Wausau men who go down, and Marathon County men, I shouldn't say just Wausau. It's from the whole county. They mobilize. They end up going initially to Camp Harvey. I should also say here, when I talk about the 3rd Regiment and the 2nd Regiment here, the experiences I'm going to be drawing from are from a bunch of different places, and particularly there's one source here. The Clark County Historical Society has an amazing letter and some resources here that I pulled from, basically the account of one of the, I think maybe the wife of one of the soldiers. I'm not entirely sure, but it is a very, very clear sort of breakdown based off of some letters of what actually happened. And because Neillsville is also in the 3rd Regiment, they will also be part of this. I should say also, the 2nd and 3rd Regiments are going to be, as we can see here, they get the call to report to Chickamauga, or close to that, kind of outside of, well, here. This is kind of where the battle in the Civil War happens, Chickamauga. Now it's a national park, and this is a nice spot to have a camp. So they set up Camp Thomas. It's outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. They will be then joined after 6 or 7 months of, or 6 or 7 weeks, I should say, of intense training. They get grouped in along with the 2nd Regiment and the 3rd Regiment of Wisconsin, and then there's a regiment from Pennsylvania. And that becomes one sort of larger unit. Battalion, I think is what that would be called. Anyway, that experience, these guys are all going to do the same thing. After Chickamauga, they then, so that's basically the summer. On July 7th, they get the order to report to Charleston. They arrive in Charleston, South Carolina. They spend a couple weeks kind of waiting for orders at this point, and then here they are kind of waiting. I don't know if this is probably in Tennessee, but these are 2 of the guys there. While they're in Charleston, they do some practice matches, and apparently it was 110 degrees sun. There's a lot of these sort of stories that are reported on, but eventually, though, they get the order to go to Puerto Rico, and they are off later in July. So what's been happening in the war up to this point? Well, In order to land in Puerto Rico, we have to let the Navy do their start. That's the first kind of stage of the war. The United States, before we can land troops in any of the island communities that we have to rest, like Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, we're going to need to secure the sea. So the Navy gets to work doing that. I'm not going to talk too much about the Philippine and the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater is its own sort of story. It's very quick. This is like the biggest battle in which Commodore Perry and the Americans soundly defeat the Spanish Navy. I think they suffer like a couple people who are injured, and I think there's one guy who has a heart attack, completely incidental to the actual fighting. So we don't lose anybody in killed in combat in this fight. The Spanish are not so fortunate. Basically, then we kind of lock down the Philippines. I'll just also note that a couple months later, they dispatch a battleship, or not a battleship, a battle cruiser, and some transports to take Guam. And they fire a warning shot saying, "Hey, we're coming." And apparently, the Spanish came out, the garrison came out and said, "Hey." They tried to apologize. They didn't have any gunpowder, so otherwise they would have signaled back. And then they were like, "What do you mean?" And oh, we're at war. They didn't. Nobody told them that the United States and Spain were at war. So that was again, the Pacific Theater is a lot simpler compared to the Caribbean, in which we have moments of true grit. The Spanish have a very large military garrison in Cuba, having fought the insurgents for years. And so it's going to be a little bit. So famously, we have the campaign outside of Santiago, and you have events like Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, or here Teddy's Colts, taking the Battle of San Juan Hill. There's also sort of elements like the Buffalo Soldiers, the African American unit, fighting as free men for the United States for the first time in this capacity. And they commit themselves admirably as well. But when we get to Puerto Rico, it's a little different. So let's talk about Puerto Rico. Once we kind of had Cuba under wraps, we then start to, in July, send troops. Cuba was attacked in May. That's when we landed troops and started that. By July, we're starting to get into Puerto Rico, which we'd also love to take because the Spanish have a fairly large garrison here. So the Spanish control the island. After the Navy kind of secures the shipping, the lanes, we end up sending, excuse me, sending some landing craft to bring in the troops. Now, initially, we knew that the northern part here, let me do the pointer. Up here near San Juan, where along the coast, this was heavily fortified, so we weren't going to land there. Initially, the idea was to land over here in Fajardo. I'm sorry, I am not a Spanish speaker. I'm going to butcher all of these places. Sincere apologies on that. But we're over here. Now, apparently, the military commander in charge realized this was a bad idea, that the Spanish had fortified this. And so as they were sending troops, they rerouted them instead down here to Guanica. And this becomes the landing point, and they push out from there. This map, by the way, I just kind of made. I did not steal this from anybody. I did not research the front. These are sort of general movements. So this may play out slightly different. We're going to be mostly looking on this section here, though. So the 3rd Regiment and Company G of Wassa and the other of the 2nd and 3rd Regiment from Wisconsin, they are going to arrive, here. Couple days after the landing, so they're not participating in staying this. The Spanish, by the way, see the overwhelming force coming, and they go, "Nope, we're going to back out." So the next couple weeks is just going to be the Spanish, harassing the Americans as they approach, but they're pulling back. So we're not going to see any like standing and fighting like you see in other places. So they give up the city of Ponce. That's kind of a major place there. It's around this time that the Wisconsin guys end up arriving. And then we push on to the city of Cuomo. Coamo. Again, I apologize for my pronunciation. This is one of the areas where, and here is, again, I'm taking this from the excellent coverage stuff here. This is the 3rd Infantry, Wisconsin, prior to entering the city. So this is them outside of it. And this is going to be kind of the staging ground. From here now, we've got to push up. There's some movement up here. I will say also taking this city was kind of one of the high points. I'll show up a little bit in a second. But the next stage is we're going to have to push up. There's a mountain region here, and there's a pass. And the Spanish are heavily dug in here at A Bonito. The Wisconsin's 3rd was on the line, apparently ready to go to fight this, and they were still using like line infantry from these the Civil War sort of tactics. They were just going to go. When word came, at this point it's August 12th, I believe, that ceasefire. We're no longer pushing, and at that point, I guess there we go. So this is ultimately kind of the rough area that the United States ends up taking of Puerto Rico. They just kind of hold down the fort for the next couple weeks. And then eventually we get some peace. Okay. Uh-oh, here we go. This is just from Wisconsin Rapids. This was an account here. I'll just point out over here the many acts of heroism. There were many acts of personal heroism, both in the artillery and among the 3rd Wisconsin Volunteers. Captains McCoy and Lee of Companies L and F got rifles and blazed away from exposed position near the artillery. This is all outside of that one city of Coamo. Captain Lee's wrist was grazed by a ball as he was raising his arm to fire a rifle borrowed from one of the men. When the battery ran out of ammunition, they send somebody back. There's a lot of this sort of stuff. It's very excitement. The last excitement was on the private of a battery. A lad of not only 20 years heard the order go back for the remaining gun. He had 4 horses and started to go. Like, this is very different than these sort of acts of heroism that you'll see in like other wars. This is about it. One guy kind of like, there were a couple people who end up getting, I think one guy got a bullet through him. There's another. The only casualties that all of Wisconsin participants, of which there was a couple thousand, there were 2 people who died in combat. They were hit by an artillery shell, and they were like more than a mile away from where the action was happening. They just happened to get unlucky. A shell came down and killed them. Almost all of the people who end up dying in this are dying of disease, which is not uncommon, but the scale is it's a lot. There are accounts of the Wisconsin or even some of the Wausau veterans who come back here, about how they were part of. Ultimately, the city was taken. The fighting happened by the Pennsylvania unit, although the 3rd had the advantage of coming in sort of and actually securing the city. So they were able to like raise the American flag over it, and they got the honors of that. But they didn't actually see any direct fighting. But they were pretty adjacent to it, and there was a real chance, had they not had that, ceasefire, that they would have definitely seen some tough fighting, which they found out over the course of the next couple weeks as they were, the armistice was being sort of negotiated, and the treaty. They got a better sense of what they were going to be up against, and they realized, oh, these guys are really dug in. There's no flanking opportunity. It's a valley and mountains. This would have been a bad time. Yeah, it's like it says here, but for an armistice, a bloody battle would have occurred, but they didn't. So yeah, eventually, here they are signing. This is the French ambassador, sort of as a proxy for the Spanish, signing it. But we have peace. Eventually, it takes a while. It's signed. I think the agreement is like in December, and it gets ratified by the American Congress or whatever in February, I think. But basically, it's over, and we end up going on. This is the extent of just sort of an account here of during the war. So the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th There's also a battery A of the 1st Light Artillery, and there's a cavalry unit, I think, that takes part as well. But you can see here the original strength. They didn't need to add anybody. There were about just under 5,500 men who took part in the conflict. Most of them, the 1st Regiment never actually was deployed to Puerto Rico. It was in Florida as a garrison of a base, although they might have gotten deployed if we had to keep going. The 4th Regiment, as I said, gets sidetracked with some labor disputes in Oshkosh, but then they go down to Alabama. And again, the idea was maybe if we have to keep deploying troops to Havana, to take, or to Cuba, to take Santiago and all of that, they would be part of that. But they never needed to. The war was over, and you can see here the scale. There were a total loss of 143 people who died of the soldiers, of which, of those 143, 141 were of disease. And there's a number of other people who, by the way, caught malaria and other diseases. It was not a fun time. Like, it's a pretty small number. A lot of people had complications going on after that. So yeah. Anyway, they get back. And I'll point out here, Louis Marchetti, in his mammoth book on the history of Marathon County, he was personally very involved in all of the stateside, the home front sort of thing. So he dedicates an entire chapter to this affair. So he explains, it's a little bit of the history. I could flip, but I just had these preloaded. So he puts the entire address by the mayor, his entire address that he gave. This is all after they come back. They throw a huge party. This is October 31st. So they welcome back the troops, and then they basically throw a party. They have dances that are organized, speeches after speech. They had all sorts of stuff. As we can see more and more, it just keeps going on and on. At the sort of conclusion of this, for his help in organizing their reception, the now veterans, now civilians once again, of Company G, they present Louis Marchetti a fine gold-headed cane with the inscription "Presented to Louis Marchetti by Company G, 3rd Wisconsin Volunteers," which apparently he valued such highly that he dedicated an entire chapter, and then he lists all of the people. Quite a few more people here than you saw, and these are just the WASA people as well. So yeah. I will also note, I didn't put it in here, but even there was one guy from the Knowlton area, and his return, the whole community of Knowlton turned out, men clapping and women, waving their handkerchiefs, and they welcome back with definitely a hero's welcome. What are the results of the war? Well, the U.S. directly acquires territory of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Read that backwards. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We also gain a protectorate in Cuba. When war was being postured back at the beginning of the year, Congress put in a proviso saying that, like, okay, we are doing this for the Cubans. We are helping the colonized. We are colonized former colonies ourselves. We do not want to be colonizers. We are not going to take Cuba. That is not explicitly what we are going to do. They are our protectorate. That's different, kind of. Didn't say anything, though, about the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, which we definitely take, and they become American territories. Yeah. We also have sort of a multi-generational existential crisis about what it means to be an American. Are we an empire now? Like, we went into this going humanitarian, and this is, all the jingoism and pomp and circumstance. We're excited. We're going to get our glory. We're going to do that. We're going to show ourselves to be the equals of the Spanish. We prove that. And then we're left with, oh, well, I mean, we kind of have an empire now. I mean, we have territory. The Philippines don't remain, but we still have Guam, as you see here, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. Cuba's not there, but, we're going to keep an eye on them. Yeah. We also, by the way, Puerto Ricans remain American citizens. They are territory of the United States, as is Guam. Philippines aren't. We can't let them go immediately, though. We have to, because they don't like the American rule any more than like the Spanish. So this is like, yeah, we end up basically spending the next 3 or 4 years in a grueling campaign against the Filipino people to keep them in line so that we can kind of turn them into a protectorate. Um, there is no Geneva Convention at this point in time. Bears mentioning that if there was, we probably would be committing war crimes explicitly. And the experience of that is very different than the experience of the Company G in Puerto Rico, where they get to get excited and get to shoot some guns, but nobody really sees the consequences of that. They get to kind of go off for a year, um, you know, meet new people, see the world, come back a hero. But like there's also some lingering concerns about what this means. Who are we as a country? I mean, I say this like this isn't just a general thing. There are people in the Marathon County area like Neil Brown, who was pretty well. He has some complicated ideas about this, but prominent lawyer, part of the WASU group, all of that. He has very conflicting ideas about what this means to be for Americans. The experience is not it changes, right? And this kind of sets the stage for the 20th century and the developments that come. So yeah, that I guess is kind of a very quick overview of the Spanish-American War and Marathon County's part in it. Like I said, I always kind of just assumed based off of what I found, and I still there's more to dig up, I'm sure. I didn't really go into the specifics of their individual lives, in part because the Company G, I know their names. I know that they did serve. We don't have a lot of personal accounts or direct accounts. It's not to say they're not out there, but I didn't pull those for this purpose. But certainly, this is not the experience that 6 months ago I thought that they had. I thought they just went down and were just occupying, for a couple months. But they did get pretty close to see some combat, and for that, understandably, are considered veterans. They absolutely served. They came back to the United States and integrated and became, members of the communities here and other places. There was a veterans group that gets us created here for the Spanish-American War vets, just like as we had like the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic for the Civil War veterans, and the American Legion, which would be created later for in a grander scale of veterans that have served. And yeah, very much a part. Even if it's not one of these wars in which we have like, you go to the courthouse grounds, you don't see a statue for the Spanish-American War vets like you do other conflicts, but certainly something that was, I guess, for this time, important as an experience around the turn of the century. Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to call it because, wow, I went over a little bit longer than I thought I was going to, but that's okay. If you're interested in military history, we're going to be continuing to talk about some stuff. Next week, Brenna Welsh, our archival assistant here, has been processing a collection of letters that we've received from a World War II veteran that many of you will know, of Joe Dusky. So we're going to share some of the stories there, and more stuff to come. Also this weekend is, if you're watching this live or close thereafter, we have the last History Speaks of the season for 2023, and that is going to be somewhat adjacent here. Professor Brett Barker is going to be back to share one of his great expertise, which is the Civil War, specifically looking at the Gettysburg Address, this tremendous speech given by Abraham Lincoln that has, again, like a lot of, has had a very important role in American culture ever since. So after 160 years, what does that look like? It should be a great program. And so yeah, if you're looking for something to do on Saturday, come on down to the museum and learn about some history. All right. Well, with that, I will say thanks for watching. If you're still watching, appreciate you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you next week for some more history chats.